Not every cry is loud enough for people to hear, but sometimes it's enough for the one who still listens. The town of Hollow Creek slept under a thin veil of mist, the kind that softened the edges of streetlights and made everything feel a little further away than it really was. And at exactly 2:17 a.m., when even the wind seemed to hold its breath, a German shepherd sat alone in the middle of Maple Street, unmoving, eyes fixed on the old Carter house at the end of the block, a place no one had stepped inside for over 30 years. And instead of barking, the dog let out a low, trembling sound that didn't belong to any ordinary night, a sound closer to grief than warning, rising and falling in slow, measured intervals like it was answering something only it could hear, and the few people who noticed only pulled their coats tighter and walked faster, muttering about stray animals and bad weather, because it was easier to ignore what didn't make sense than to stand still and listen. But Daniel Hayes didn't walk past. He never really did. Not since the war taught him that the smallest sounds often carried the heaviest truths. And from the porch of the small house he'd been fixing for the past 3 weeks, he watched the dog with a quiet stillness, noticing how it didn't shift, didn't pace, didn't even glance around, just stared straight ahead as if something inside that abandoned house was staring back. And when the dog let out another soft cry, Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, not exactly, but recognition, the kind that comes when a memory brushes against the present without asking permission. And he stepped down from the porch, boots pressing into the damp gravel, the night air cool against his skin, carrying a faint metallic scent like rain that never quite arrived. And as he got closer, the dog finally moved, just slightly, turning its head toward him with eyes that didn't look wild or lost, but focused, almost patient, as if it had been waiting for someone to notice. And for a moment, neither of them moved, the silence stretching thin between them, until another sound slipped through the air, so faint it could have been mistaken for the settling of old wood or the shifting of temperature. But Daniel heard it clearly, a soft, deliberate knock, coming not from the door, not from the windows, but from somewhere deeper inside the house, steady and measured, like a rhythm that refused to fade. And the dog's ears lifted just slightly, not in alarm, but in recognition. And that was when Daniel understood something he couldn't explain. The dog wasn't trying to warn anyone. It was trying to answer something that had been waiting far too long to be heard. Daniel did not reach for the door right away because something about the rhythm made him pause, the kind of pause that came from years of learning when to move and when to listen. And the sound came again, soft and steady, like knuckles brushing against wood from a place too deep to measure, and the dog shifted closer to him, not pressing forward, not pulling away, simply aligning itself with his steps as if they had already made this decision together. And the air around the Carter house felt different the closer he got, heavier somehow, as if the silence there had been collecting for years without anyone disturbing it. And when he finally stood at the base of the porch, he noticed how untouched everything was, the railing worn but intact, the windows dim with age yet unbroken, and the front door slightly misaligned in its frame as though it had settled into place over decades of waiting. And the dog let out another low sound, softer this time, almost careful, and Daniel placed his hand against the wood, expecting cold stillness, but instead he felt the faintest vibration beneath his palm, so subtle it might have been mistaken for his own pulse if it had not continued in that same quiet pattern, steady, patient, unchanging. And he drew a slow breath, the scent of old timber and dust rising from the porch boards, carrying something else beneath it, something older, something that did not belong to the present moment. And for a second, he considered walking away, telling himself it was nothing more than settling beams or distant pipes, the kind of explanation people preferred because it allowed them to sleep at night. But the dog did not move, its eyes fixed on the door, waiting, not with urgency, but with a kind of quiet trust that made turning away feel like a choice he would remember for the rest of his life. And so Daniel reached for the handle, feeling the worn metal cool against his fingers. And when he turned it, the latch gave with a soft click that echoed louder than it should have in the stillness. And the door opened just enough to let a breath of air slip out, cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of something long undisturbed. And inside, the darkness was not empty, it felt layered, like the house had been holding on to every moment it had ever known. And the dog stepped forward first, slow and deliberate, paused quiet against the threshold, and Daniel followed, closing the door behind him without thinking, the outside world fading instantly as the dim interior wrapped around them. And for a moment there was nothing but the sound of their breathing, until it came again, that same soft knock, clearer now, coming from somewhere below, and the dog turned its head toward the floor, ears lifting, eyes steady. And Daniel felt it then, not fear, but certainty, the kind that settled deep in the chest, telling him that whatever had been waiting inside this house was not trying to be found by everyone, only by someone willing to stay long enough to hear it. Daniel lowered himself slowly to one knee, his hand brushing across the wooden floor, as if the house might respond to touch the way it responded to sound. And beneath his palm the vibration returned, faint but steady, not random, not shifting, but consistent in a way that made it feel intentional, like something below was keeping time without ever losing count. And the dog stepped closer, placing one paw gently against a section of the floor near the center of the room, its claws clicking softly against the boards before going still. And for a moment everything seemed to settle into a deeper silence, as if the house itself was waiting to see what he would do next. And Daniel leaned forward, his eyes tracing the seams between the planks until he noticed it, a slight difference in the wood grain, a narrow outline that did not match the rest of the floor, subtle enough that no one passing through casually would ever see it, but once noticed, impossible to ignore. And he pressed down along the edge, feeling a small give beneath his weight, followed by the soft release of something long held in place. And the board shifted just enough to reveal a thin gap, from which a cooler breath of air slipped upward, carrying with it a scent that was not decay, not dust, but something strangely clean, like stone after rain, untouched and preserved. And the dog let out a quiet exhale, not a whine this time, but something calmer, as if a question had just been answered. And Daniel slid his fingers into the gap, lifting carefully until the hidden panel rose with a slow, reluctant motion, revealing a narrow opening beneath the floor. And from that darkness, the sound came again, clearer now, a gentle knock echoing upward in the same steady rhythm, patient and unwavering. And Daniel felt a memory stir at the edge of his mind, something from years ago, long nights spent listening for faint signals beneath collapsed structures, waiting for signs of life that might still be holding on somewhere beneath the surface. Except this felt different, not urgent, not desperate, but deliberate, as if whatever lay below was not trying to escape, but simply trying to be heard. And he hesitated only for a second before reaching for the old flashlight clipped to his belt, its beam cutting a narrow path into the darkness below, revealing the top of a short wooden ladder leading down into a space that should not have existed beneath a house like this. And the dog stepped back slightly, not out of fear, but out of respect, its eyes fixed on the opening, as if it understood that whatever came next belonged to Daniel alone. And he took a slow breath, the air around him still and heavy, the outside world already feeling distant and irrelevant. And as he placed his foot on the first rung of the ladder, the knocking stopped, not abruptly, not with finality, but gently, like a conversation pausing the moment someone finally decides to listen. Daniel moved down the ladder slowly, each step measured, the old wood holding his weight with a quiet creak that echoed softly through the narrow space. And as he descended, the air shifted, cooler and stiller, carrying a faint mineral scent that reminded him of stone caverns and places untouched by time. And when his boots finally met the ground below, the beam of his flashlight widened across a small, underground room that should not have existed beneath a forgotten house, its walls lined with smooth stone instead of dirt, as if someone had built it carefully rather than carved it out in haste. And the ceiling was low but steady, supported by thick wooden beams that showed no signs of rot, preserved in a way that made the entire space feel suspended outside the passage of years. And for a moment Daniel simply stood there, listening. But the knocking did not return, replaced instead by a silence so complete it felt almost deliberate, as if whatever had been reaching out had now chosen to wait. And he took a step forward, the light revealing a narrow table against the far wall, its surface clean, untouched by dust, holding a small metal box and a lantern that had long since gone cold, and beside it, a chair pulled back just slightly, as though someone had stood up from it not long ago. And that was when the unease settled in. not sharp or panicked, but deep and steady, the kind that made a man aware that he had stepped into something that did not belong to the present. And behind him, above the opening, the dog remained still, its silhouette framed by the dim light from the house above, watching without making a sound. And Daniel moved closer to the table, the beam of his flashlight catching faint markings along the stone wall, lines etched carefully into the surface, not random, but deliberate, forming a pattern that repeated in even intervals. And as he traced them with his eyes, something about their spacing stirred a memory, the same steady rhythm he had heard before, not in this house, but years ago, in places where men listened for signals beneath layers of debris, counting seconds between faint sounds, waiting for confirmation that something remained. And his gaze shifted back to the metal box, its surface worn but intact, a simple latch holding it closed. And as he reached for it, the air seemed to tighten slightly, not in resistance, but in awareness, like the room itself was paying attention. And he paused, his hand hovering just above the lid, listening again. And then, softly, almost gently, the knocking returned, not from below this time, but from the walls around him, faint and steady, echoing through the stone in the same measured pattern. And Daniel realized with a quiet certainty that whatever had been calling out before was not trapped beneath him. It had always been here, all around him, waiting for someone to come close enough to understand that it was not trying to be found, only remembered. Daniel did not pull his hand away this time, even as the sound moved through the stone with that same quiet persistence, because there was something in the rhythm that no longer felt like a warning, but a memory repeating itself, waiting to be understood. And when his fingers finally touched the surface of the metal box, the knocking softened, not disappearing, but easing, like a voice lowering once it knew it had been heard. And the latch gave with a gentle pressure, opening without resistance, as though it had never truly been sealed. And inside, there was no treasure, no gold, nothing that matched the weight of the moment except a stack of neatly folded papers and a small, worn notebook, its edges softened by time but preserved with care. And Daniel lifted it slowly, the pages releasing a faint scent of aged ink and dry air. And as he opened it, the beam of his flashlight revealed lines of handwriting, steady and deliberate, each entry marked with times, intervals, and notes that mirrored exactly what he had been hearing. The same measured knocks recorded over and over again, each one counted, each one acknowledged. And his breath slowed as he read, realizing that whoever had written this had not been afraid of the sound. They had studied it, lived with it, perhaps even trusted it. And one line near the middle of the page caught his attention, written more firmly than the rest, as if it had mattered more than all the others. It does not call for help, it calls for someone to stay. And Daniel felt something shift inside him, not confusion, not fear, but a quiet understanding that settled deeper than logic. And above him, the dog shifted slightly, its paws brushing against the floorboards as if sensing the change. And for the first time since entering the house, it did not cry. It simply waited, calm and still. And Daniel turned the page, finding another entry, older. The ink slightly faded but still clear enough to read. The sound repeats every 27 seconds, always the same. Never early, never late, like a heartbeat that belongs to something the world has forgotten. And he closed his eyes briefly, counting without thinking, feeling the seconds pass in the silence. And when the next knock came, right on time, it did not startle him. It confirmed something he could not yet explain. And as he looked around the room again, the walls no longer felt empty, the air no longer felt still. Everything seemed to carry a quiet presence, not something watching him, but something existing alongside him, patient and unchanging. And Daniel understood then that this place had never been abandoned, not in the way people believed. It had simply been left behind by those who chose not to listen. And as he held the notebook in his hands, the weight of it felt heavier than it should have, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel did not feel like he had stumbled into something unknown. He felt like he had arrived somewhere that had been waiting for him all along. Daniel did not rush to climb back up the ladder because something in the room had shifted in a way that made leaving feel incomplete, as if walking away now would mean missing the one thing the silence had been trying to offer. And he turned the notebook over in his hands, noticing the faint indentation on the inside cover, a mark left by something that had once been tucked there, and when he slid his fingers along the crease, he found it, a thin, folded slip of paper hidden so carefully it could have been missed even by someone searching for it. And he unfolded it slowly, the fibers stiff but intact, revealing a single line written in the same steady hand. If you are reading this, then you heard it too, and that means it chose you. And Daniel let out a quiet breath he had not realized he was holding, the words settling into the space around him like they belonged there. And above him, the dog shifted again. But this time it did not stay at the opening. It began to descend, one careful step at a time, its body moving with a calm certainty that mirrored his own, and when it reached the ground beside him, it did not look around or hesitate. It simply sat at his side, eyes forward, as if acknowledging that whatever this place was, they were now part of it together. And the knocking returned, softer now, almost distant, yet still precise, still unwavering. And Daniel found himself counting again without meaning to, the seconds passing in a steady rhythm that matched the lines in the notebook. And as the next knock came exactly on time, something clicked into place in his mind, not a memory, but a realization that the sound was not coming from one direction, not from beneath or behind the walls, but from everywhere at once, carried through the structure itself, as if the house had learned to hold on to it, to repeat it, to preserve it the way the notebook had preserved the record of it. And he looked back at the etched markings along the stone, seeing them differently now, not as random lines, but as a form of counting, a way for someone to keep track of something that never changed, something that never stopped. And he imagined the person who had sat in that chair, listening night after night, choosing not to run, choosing not to ignore it, but to stay, to understand, to accept, and the weight of that choice settled quietly into him, not as pressure, but as an invitation. And the dog leaned slightly against his leg, a small, grounding presence that reminded him he was not alone in this. And for the first time since the sound had begun, Daniel did not feel like he was searching for its source. He felt like he was beginning to understand its purpose, not a warning, not a call for help, but something else entirely, something that existed simply to be heard by the one person willing to remain still long enough to listen. And as the next knock echoed gently through the stone, Daniel did not react. He did not question it. He simply stood there in the quiet, holding the notebook in one hand and the folded paper in the other, realizing that some things in this world were not meant to be solved or explained, only recognized, and once recognized, never truly ignored again. Daniel remained in the underground room longer than he intended, though time itself had begun to feel less certain, stretched thin between each measured knock that continued to echo through the stone with quiet precision. And at some point, without a clear decision, he found himself sitting in the chair beside the table, the same chair that had once belonged to someone who had chosen to stay before him. And the wood beneath him was firm, not brittle, as if it had been waiting to be used again. And the dog settled at his feet, its breathing slow and steady, no longer tense, no longer searching, just present. And together they listened, not for answers, not for change, but simply for the rhythm that had never stopped. And Daniel opened the notebook again, turning to the final pages where the handwriting grew lighter, not weaker, but calmer, as if the person writing had reached a place beyond questioning. And one entry stood alone near the end, written without a time, without a count. "It is not alone, and neither am I." And he read it twice, letting the words settle into the quiet around him. And for a moment, he could almost imagine the presence of the one who had written it, not as a figure or a shadow, but as a feeling, a steady awareness that this space had once been shared, not abandoned. And the knocking continued, softer now, almost distant, yet still exact. And Daniel noticed something he had not before, that between each sound, there was no emptiness, only a deeper kind of silence, one that did not press or weigh down, but held steady like something alive beneath the surface. And he closed the notebook gently, placing it back on the table with care, not out of obligation, but out of respect. And as he stood, the air shifted again, not colder, not heavier, but lighter, as if something had quietly changed without needing to announce it. And the dog rose with him, stretching slightly before looking toward the ladder, its posture calm, its eyes clear. And for the first time since this had begun, Daniel did not feel like he was being led. He felt like he was being accompanied, and together they moved toward the ladder, each step upward carrying them back toward the surface, toward the world that continued without knowing what lay beneath it. And when Daniel reached the top and stepped onto the wooden floor of the house, the silence there felt different too, not empty, but settled, like a place that no longer needed to call out. And he paused, looking back down into the opening for just a moment, listening for the next knock. But when it came, it was softer than before, almost like an echo fading into distance. And he understood then that the sound had not stopped. It had simply changed, no longer asking to be found, because it had already been heard. And as he gently lowered the hidden panel back into place, the house above seemed to breathe in a quiet, steady way, and the dog stepped beside him, leaning lightly against his leg, and Daniel rested his hand on its head, not in reassurance, but in acknowledgement, knowing that some things do not end when they are discovered. They simply become part of you, carried forward in silence, waiting for the moment when someone else might need to listen. Morning came slowly over Hollow Creek, the kind of pale, quiet dawn that softened everything it touched. And when Daniel stepped out of the Carter house, the world felt unchanged in all the ways that mattered to everyone else. The same cracked sidewalks, the same distant hum of traffic, the same people moving through their routines without ever glancing toward the place they had long decided did not belong to them. And yet something within him had shifted so subtly it could not be seen, only felt, like a weight that had been carried for years finally settling into something lighter, something steadier. And the dog walked beside him without hesitation, its steps calm, its eyes no longer searching the shadows for something unseen, but moving forward with a quiet certainty that matched his own. And as they reached the edge of the street, Daniel paused, looking back at the house for just a moment, noticing how it no longer felt distant or forgotten, but present in a way that did not need attention to exist. And he wondered how many times people had passed it without ever realizing what it held. How many chances had gone unnoticed simply because no one had stopped long enough to listen, and the thought did not bring frustration or regret, only a quiet understanding that some things were not meant for everyone, only for those who arrived at the right moment, in the right silence. And as they continued down the street, a faint breeze moved through the trees, carrying with it a sound so soft it could have been mistaken for nothing at all, a gentle rhythm, distant and steady. And Daniel did not turn back this time. He did not need to, because he recognized it now not as a call, but as something that had become part of the world around him, woven into the spaces most people overlooked. And later that afternoon, as he worked on the small house he had been repairing, the sound returned again, not from the ground or the walls, but from somewhere within the quiet itself. And he paused, setting down his tools, closing his eyes for just a second as he counted without thinking, 1, 2, 3, until the faint echo came right on time. And instead of questioning it, he nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something unseen, and the dog lifted its head from where it rested nearby, not alarmed, not confused, but calm, as if it too understood that nothing needed to be done, nothing needed to be solved. And in that moment, Daniel realized that what he had found beneath that house was not something to uncover or reveal, but something to carry, a reminder that not every signal demands action, not every mystery requires an answer, and sometimes the only thing that matters is the willingness to stay, to listen, and to recognize that even in the quietest places, something is always speaking, waiting for the one person who has not forgotten how to hear it. That night, Hollow Creek settled into its usual quiet, the kind that wrapped around the town like a familiar blanket, and from a distance, nothing had changed. Not the dim glow of porch lights, not the slow passing of cars along the main road, not the old Carter house standing at the end of Maple Street, as if time had simply forgotten to move it forward. And yet inside Daniel, something continued to unfold in a way that did not need to be seen to be real. And as he sat on the worn wooden steps, outside the place he now called his own, the dog resting beside him with its head low and eyes half closed, the air carried that same faint rhythm once more, softer than ever, almost indistinguishable from the natural sounds of the night. And still, he heard it clearly, not with effort, not with focus, but with a kind of quiet awareness that had become part of him. And he found himself counting again without meaning to, not because he needed to confirm it, but because it felt like acknowledging something that had chosen not to fade. And when the sound returned exactly as expected, steady and unchanged, he allowed a small breath to escape, not in surprise, but in acceptance. And the dog shifted slightly, pressing closer for a moment before settling. Again, its presence steady and grounding, and Daniel looked out toward the dark outline of the Carter house in the distance, noticing how it no longer held any sense of mystery or distance, but simply existed as part of the same world he now moved through. And he understood then that whatever had been waiting beneath it had not been seeking to be uncovered or explained. It had been waiting to be carried forward, not as a burden, but as a quiet truth, something that would not demand attention, but would remain present for those who chose to listen. And as the night deepened, the rhythm grew softer still, fading into the natural pulse of the world until it could no longer be separated from it. And Daniel did not try to hold on to it, did not try to follow it back to its source, because he knew now that it was no longer confined to a place or a moment. It had become something larger, something woven into the silence itself. And as he rested his hand gently on the dog's head, feeling the slow rise and fall of its breath, he realized that not every story ends with answers. Some simply leave behind a way of seeing the world that was not there before, a way of noticing what others pass by, a way of understanding that even the quietest signals can carry meaning beyond explanation. And as the final trace of that steady rhythm blended completely into the night, leaving nothing but stillness behind, Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, not to listen, but to remember, knowing that somewhere, in some quiet place, something would continue, waiting patiently for the next person willing to stop, to stay, and to hear what had never truly been silent at all.